Welcome to the electronic archive of presentations from Performance Incentives, the Growing Impact on American K-12 Education, a national conference hosted at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University in 2008. The conference was sponsored by the National Center on Performance Incentives, a research and development center funded in part by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. You are watching a video presentation from Professor Neal, a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, on designing incentive systems for schools.
So what I want to do today is to take an approach that I think is different than most of the approaches that are taken to this topic at conferences like this. Usually people will kind of start, well, we have government provision of education, we have large collective bargaining, we have all this institutional history, and so given where we are, how could we tweak it to make things a little better? And that's not what I'm about today. What I'm about today is let's start from the very beginning and talk about first principles and say if you're going to start all over and decide an incentive system from scratch, what would you have to think about and in what order? And I think it's very instructive to do that, and I hope by the end you'll believe it was worth your time. So the issues that I want to talk about are social value, aggregating information, and correcting mistakes. And the social value issue is you can't design an optimal or a desirable incentive system until you're very clear about what you're giving incentives to people to do. And so there has to be a discussion of what are the objectives of public education or publicly funded education, and how do we assess the value of what we see and measure in terms of outputs of schooling. The second thing in terms of aggregating information is how do we put systems in place that will provide incentives for the people that work in schools to act upon and use the information they have that may not be contained in anybody's data warehouse. And the last is, how do we design a system that will be self-correcting? And I will begin and I will end with the following observation. I don't think there is anyone in this room that believes it is an effective policy to pay bonuses to teachers for acquiring perfunctory master's degrees at their local colleges. And it appears impossible, even though there's been uniform agreement in the research community about this for decades, it appears impossible to get rid of that personnel policy. And so there are huge downside risk of adopting one-size-fits-all personnel policies within systems that don't have self-correcting mechanisms. Okay, the value of school output. Imagine that we've got a bunch of schools, and also imagine that we have the world's best assessment technology. So there are K different skills that can possibly be measured, and they're measured perfectly. Nobody can game these tests. They're the best tests that anyone ever dreamed of. And there are K of them. Each school is numbered 1 to big S. That's our total number of schools. And each school is identical in terms of the size of the school. They all have N students. And then what we have is a matrix. The font's a little too small here, but it's X. And then the superscript is the number, so X of 5 is the matrix of all the scores for school 5. Each column is a subject, and each row is a student, okay? And so there are these 100 by K matrices for every school, okay? And so then we can have our X star matrix, and we can think of that as the spring test, and we can think of the other as the fall test. And so now, for our 100 schools in our hypothetical school system, we've got 200 matrices that describe where achievement was in the fall and now where it is in the spring. If society began the school year at big X, which is the whole 100 matrices, how does society evaluate the relative values of ending the year at any one of the infinite possible X stars that it could be? So if you were the person that was in charge of supervising the state superintendent of education in this fictitious state, how would you go through the possible X stars that could come out of that state and say, if I'm doing a performance evaluation on that state secretary of education, I view this possible set of spring scores as better than another? Remember, we're trying to get a one-dimensional ranking of all of these matrices, but they've got hundreds of thousands of elements, okay? And the other thing is, if we took any two schools and we took their fall matrix and their spring matrix and took all the differences between them, okay, which is a big number given that there's 100 elements in each one, times K, so K times 100, how would we look at the contrast between the two matrices for any school and say, this school did better than that school? Okay? And the point is that in most policy discussions on accountability, people don't start here and say, what do we really mean by better? How could we write down a set of axioms such that when we described verbally what we meant by better, we would have a set of procedures that would agree with that after we finished running the computer programs? And what makes this so difficult is you don't have prices, okay? If somehow we had the biggest study in the world and it could tell us what it was worth in terms of lifetime earnings or value in dollars to society to move a scale score from 150 to 200 on any given test, or to move it by 1 point on any given test, well, we could run the Department of Education the way they run the Department of the Interior, right? They auction off the trees, and then the companies cut down the trees and sell them on the market and keep the difference. We could auction off the right to educate students, and then the schools would receive at the end of the year the difference between the value they created in dollars for the students and the bid they made for the right to educate the students. And that would get us first best in education. But we don't have prices, okay? And so when you don't have prices, you have to find some other way to talk about the desirability of output. And you're going to end up, one way or the other, having a ranking, because you don't have a cardinal scale that you can translate directly into money. And we pay people in terms of money. And so the best you're going to be able to do is to have a ranking of people and then prizes associated with different ranks. That's all you can do when you have an organization whose output can't be placed in dollar terms, okay? And so I want to talk about, to begin with, what would be some desirable properties of a ranking procedure. The first is you would start with a set of documents that said, these are our objectives, and they would be very clear so that a third-party observer who had no idea what the accountability system actually looked like, but had the document that said these are the objectives of the system, would have some hope of looking at these matrices of test scores by schools themselves without knowing what the accountability system is, and in most cases being able to know that this school is going to be ranked higher than that school without seeing the specific procedures that were adopted. All right? The second thing is that the mapping between the priorities that you write down and the procedures that you actually adopt should be clear. They should be transparent. There shouldn't be a situation where there are all these add-ons and weights and other things that are built into it where it looks to an outside observer that there's a lot of wiggle room in here politically for people to dictate how the accountability system is going to come out by the way they weight different things. And that arbitrary choices can mean that one school is ranked higher than another, and they're arbitrary choices that are not tied to the objectives in any clear and transparent way. And I think the same way that we ended up with civil service reform at the beginning of the last century, because people did not trust the discretion of administrators in civil service, not to engage in corruption or playing games, that's not going to go away by saying we have an accountability system and a set of formulas if the formulas themselves are the creations of civil administrators and can be fudged with for political reasons. And the last point, and I'm going to stress this a lot, accountability systems should be done in what I call leagues. You should have situations where schools are being compared to other schools that serve similar types of students. I'm going to argue over and over and over again that, where I live in Illinois, that any procedure that tries to take the Wilmette schools in, one of the wealthiest communities in the country and put them on a common performance ranking with the schools in the very disadvantaged neighborhoods, 3 miles from my university. The idea that somehow there's a statistical procedure that's going to answer the question, which school performed better, when there's almost no overlap in terms of the baseline achievement of the students in a given grade, that is a nonsense exercise. That's making stuff up through statistics when there actually is no data on which school performed better because they didn't do the same job. Okay? Okay, so this is just a list of things you have to consider when you write your document about what you're trying to do. Is progress in reading and math more valuable? Math or civics? Is it socially more valuable to move a kid on a given developmental scale? Is the movement from 100 to 150 more important than the movement from 200 to 250? And then what are the values we want to place on things that are very hard to assess, like patience, persistence, learning to work and play well with others? You have to write all these things down. And the second is there has to be some coherence between the priorities and the procedures. I'm just going to give a few examples. No Child Left Behind, if you read the document, seems to be really focused on let's go after the lowest performing kids and make sure they're served. When you implement it with cutoff scores, that's not necessarily what happens. If the cutoffs are too high, the lowest performing aren't served. If you look at Florida's No Child Left Behind, this is their system. And if you start at one level with a kid and bring him to another level, then the number in the matrix tells you how many points your school gets for that. Now, if you go down and compare columns 3 to columns 4, that's the marginal gain for, if, say, you could take any kid and he might either regress or progress during the fall, but by January he's about a 3. Well, what's the gain for different kids that started at different places that are all a 3 by January? What's the gain for getting them to a 4 by the end of the year? Well, in two rows, it's 40. In other rows, it's one row it's a little less than 100. In some other rows, it's more than 200. What type of social value function would ever say that the differences between these columns make sense in terms of implementing a well-defined objective for education? I mean, I tried for a long time. I can't reverse engineer a reason the numbers would ever be like that. We'll skip California. It's not quite as, Rick and I talked about this. You might be able to figure out what they're trying to do there. But in Florida, it's really hard to figure out, how would you reverse engineer a story that would ever make sense of that system? Now I want to get to comparisons of homogeneous agents. Imagine you got two schools, Okay, and think of this as a junior high. You got a test in 6th grade when they start and a test in 8th grade when they enter. And the x-axis is their baseline achievement, and the y is where they come out. You've got your favorite non-parametric function here, and what it tells you is there's so little overlap in the two schools in terms of how the kids come in 6th grade. There's no information about which school does better with any particular type of student. And value-added methods and interval scales are not an answer to this problem. If God told you, this is the point down here, if God told you that the average value added in one school was bigger than another, why would you care? Because you're moving them at different points on the scale, and if one school typically moves kids from 150 to 180, and another school typically moves kids from 250 to 280, who in the world knows if it's a lot more work in terms of the effort that it requires students to go from 150 to 180? Who in the world knows if it's a lot more valuable for the students to go to 150 to 180 than 250 to 280? Interval scales are nice in that you can say complete sentences about what the test scores mean. But you hand out personnel policy rewards based on money. And if you don't have the knowledge to turn interval scales into money, then you can't use those methods as a way to do personnel policy. All you can do is try to rank people and then reward people within ranks. And if they don't do the same job, if they aren't teaching the same type of kids, it's a meaningless ranking. So we've got to get to a place, and I'll skip this, we've got to get to a place where we group schools into comparison sets where they're comparing their performance against people that do the same job. And this will not lead to a situation where you don't get performance improvements in low-performing schools, because if all the low-performing schools had weak principals and weak teachers so that anybody who really had their act together could win that league, there'd be a big incentive to join that league and take the reward money. And in fact, it's a better method than just raising base salaries for teaching in disadvantaged communities, because if you do it through reward money, the people that know that they know how to operate in those schools, as Karthik said, will be the ones that change schools. The other thing is, when you're doing ranks and you're going to assign the penalties and rewards associated with different ranks, if you're doing that in a competitive market, okay, there's a lot of competitive pressures such that if you're a law firm that doesn't have the right personnel policies, the wrong bonus policies, the wrong promotion to partner policies, you won't get the good lawyers and you'll go out of business. But if you look at the math requirements of what it takes without that competitive force to get a bonus system right, you've got to know details about the cost of effort, the measurement technology, etc. And there's no reason to believe that any one experiment, any one state is going to pick a bonus system that's efficient in the sense of providing incentives that are just the right strength and not wasting money by giving too much away, not creating too strong incentives or too weak incentives. And so we need a lot of approaches to this that say, let's have different groups, different organizations, different districts, trying different things all over the place, and different schools, and have the schools be responsible for the results. And as schools try different things and experiment, that provides information about which models work. Okay? I got to skip a bunch of stuff here. I want to get to this point, and this should be competition at the school level for several reasons. The first is, I think it is not possible to get credible estimates of the contributions of teachers within schools. Jesse Rothstein has a paper, and just the first part of it where he shows that who your 6th grade teacher is helps you explain your 4th grade achievement tells you that we're not assigning kids randomly to teachers within schools, and if we were, we should fire the principals. And economists have spent the last 20 or 30 years learning that when you're trying to understand whether people who work in a given occupation make more than people in another occupation, because the occupation is high paying or because the people in it are better, you cannot solve that question with any of the statistical models that are used in education now. And they're very sophisticated statistical models, but they are very naive behavioral models. What we learned in labor economics is if you want to crack this problem, you have to have a model where people begin a career, they get wages and raises and information about how they're doing in that career, and based on the new information, not their permanent characteristics, but based on the new information, they either switch careers or stay where they are. And the process starts. So that each period in time, what you've learned from your past assignments determines what you're assigned to in the future. So as a student goes through school, principals see who's doing well with certain types of teachers, who's doing well with other types of teachers, and that dynamically changes who they're assigned to in the future. And if you don't have a model that has a set of equations that treat the assignment as an outcome variable and dynamically model how that assignment is updated, you have no hope of cracking this problem. Now, it turns out, we've also found out in economics that when you model all of that, it takes so many assumptions and so much to model it, you don't have that much great faith in what comes out anyway. And the reason I want people to do schools is not only does it provide an incentive for the principal, if he has the right incentive system, to use all that he sees, not just the test scores, to reward people who cooperate, who reward people who mentor, to reward people who are team players. But also, with schools, you could form a league for each individual school where you say, I want to get 20 comparison schools that are very much like this school in terms of baseline of achievement and demographics, but are so far away that no one in those schools could have chosen to attend this school, and no one in my school could choose to attend those schools. And then by construction, you have constructed a data set where choice is not part of the problem. Nobody had a choice to go to another school within the sample other than the one they went to. Now, this isn't a magic bullet and it won't get rid of it, but I think it'll move us closer to a system where we can actually say that this is a school effect and it's really a school effect. And if you do it within these leagues, okay, then I am fully confident that when you match on the baseline characteristics and you choose these schools where there's not a school choice problem, that the methods that Dan and others are going to talk about will deliver reliable, maybe not perfect, but reliable information about which schools are doing better than other schools that are like them. And you want to do it relative. You don't want to do it against a fixed standard, because over time, educators should get better. And the bar should move endogenously based on how people who educate kids like your kids are doing. And if you're not keeping up, you need to. Let me go to the end here. Luckily, I talked so much yesterday because I can skip all the stuff I might have said yesterday. There are models out there by Besley and Gottok that raise the possibility that the optimal way to run a school, if we had perfectly competitive markets, that we might have an equilibrium where the optimal way to run a school is to have principals who really know how to identify talented teachers that just love to teach kids. You pay them their opportunity cost and just let them work. You put all your money into finding good screening and retention mechanisms so you identify the right people. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying it's a possibility. And then all the multitasking things are another possibility that you might want muted incentives. And the most important thing about this is to have a system where the principals or groups of teachers that are the managing partners of a school, where they are actively competing and being held accountable for results at the school level, and 1,000, approaches get to be seen. What we don't want is a system where somebody does a study in India or a study in Texas or whatever, and they say, look, we got great results, and now let's implement this in all 50 states. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen, because when we have these top-down systems that say we have the magic computer program, the magic formula, the magic whatever, we're going to rank all the schools in the state, and this is the way to do it, if that gets implemented, it may be very hard to get rid of, even if it's terrible. All right. And I want to end as I began. We need to worry seriously about any specific formula that's implemented all over the place becoming the master's degree policy of the 21st century.
A working paper and the PowerPoint slides used in this presentation are available on the National Center on Performance Incentive website.